What if the most dangerous thing you could do in Hollywood was simply say no? No to humiliation. No to silence. No to power disguised as opportunity. For decades, the entertainment industry sold us a comforting illusion that talent alone decides who rises and who disappears. We were told that if you were gifted enough, disciplined enough, charming enough, the machine would reward you. But what if that story was never true? What if success depended less on skill and more on submission? That question was raised loudly and repeatedly by one man when nearly everyone else stayed quiet. Katt Williams. And strangely enough, another man's sudden disappearance from Hollywood seems to confirm everything Katt warned us about. Terrence Howard. So before we go any further, ask yourself something simple but unsettling. Why do some stars vanish without scandal, without failure, without explanation? Why do the brightest lights sometimes go dark without a flicker of public fallout? And what does it really cost to refuse the unspoken rules? The rules no one writes down. Hollywood doesn't need contracts to enforce obedience. It doesn't need threats or public firings. It operates on something far more effective: unwritten rules. Rules whispered at after-parties. Rules implied in wardrobe fittings. Rules buried beneath the phrase, "That's just how it works." They're not listed in any handbook. No executive will ever admit they exist. But every insider knows when someone has crossed them. You only discover the rules once you've gone too far to turn back. Terrence Howard didn't lose his place in Hollywood because of lack of talent. By every measurable standard, he was a bankable leading man. He carried films. He earned Academy Award nominations. He commanded television screens in prime time. His portrayal of Lucius Lyon on Empire turned him into a cultural force again in the 2010s. Directors praised his intensity. Producers trusted his box office draw. Audiences responded to his vulnerability layered over steel. Yet suddenly, the calls slowed. Then stopped. No dramatic scandal consumed headlines. No career-ending flop buried his reputation. No public implosion explained the shift. Just silence. And Hollywood has mastered silence. It doesn't throw you out. It freezes you out. Phone calls go unanswered. Scripts stop arriving. Invitations dry up. Meetings get postponed indefinitely. The machine simply rotates without you, as if you were never central to it at all. And every time the story is told, one powerful name seems to sit quietly at the center of the broader conversation. Not accused outright, not defended aggressively, just present. Tyler Perry. Not merely a filmmaker. Not simply a billionaire. But a gatekeeper. A man who built an empire where others were denied entry. A man whose studio lot stands like a kingdom carved from resistance. So here's the uncomfortable question. What happens when a man refuses to walk through that gate the right way? The moment of refusal. Terrence Howard has always been different. Even in interviews, he spoke in a cadence that felt more philosophical than promotional. He talked about energy, about mathematics, about the way the universe vibrates. Some called him eccentric. Others called him brilliant. But no one ever called him ordinary. In private meetings, according to stories that circulated quietly, Howard would ask questions other actors wouldn't dare to ask. Why is this scene written this way? Why does this character need to be humiliated? Why is this the only arc available? Those aren't dangerous questions in art. But they can be dangerous in business. Hollywood rewards efficiency. Directors don't always want philosophical debates about symbolism. Studios don't want moral hesitations about punchlines. When millions of dollars are on the line, compliance becomes currency. Howard, by reputation, was not easily molded. He wanted dignity in his characters. He wanted complexity. He wanted respect. And in an ecosystem that thrives on predictability, unpredictability becomes risk. But was it simply creative tension? Or something deeper? Why the dress matters more than you think. Many people dismiss the controversy as overreaction. It's just comedy, they say. It's just a costume. Lighten up. But is it? Ask yourself something honest. Why does this trope fall so consistently on black male actors, and almost no one else? History gives us context whether we like it or not. For generations, Black men have been portrayed in extremes, either hyperviolent or hypercomical, either dangerous or ridiculous, either a threat to fear or a joke to laugh at. One of the most effective ways to neutralize perceived threat isn't force, it's ridicule. Turn strength into silliness. Turn masculinity into mockery. Turn presence into parody. When a physically imposing man is reduced to exaggerated femininity for laughs, he ceases to be taken seriously. He becomes safe, harmless, controllable. This isn't random humor. It's narrative conditioning. And if you look closely, you'll notice a pattern. Many of the most powerful black male entertainers in Hollywood passed through this ritual at some point in their ascent, dressing in exaggerated female caricatures, performing flamboyant femininity for mass consumption. It became tradition, or perhaps initiation, almost as if it were a test, not of talent, but of compliance. So let's ask the harder question. Who is the joke really for? When laughter becomes participation, comedy disarms us. It lowers our defenses. That's why it's so powerful. When audiences laugh, they feel superior to the character on screen. That sense of superiority becomes a quiet agreement, an endorsement. The man is diminished. The audience is elevated. The system profits. And over time, repeated images stop looking like satire and start becoming identity. Entire generations absorb distorted messages about dignity, masculinity, and worth, without ever realizing they were taught. Young boys watch. Young girls internalize. Executives calculate. Because the money doesn't come from the laughter. It comes from what the laughter normalizes. So ask yourself, who benefits when one group keeps its seriousness, while another is encouraged to play the fool? And what happens when someone refuses to participate in the joke? Enter the man Hollywood called crazy. For years, Katt Williams was portrayed as unstable, paranoid, a brilliant comedian who lost his way. His mugshots circulated. His outbursts were clipped into viral compilations. Headlines used words like meltdown and rant. But what if that narrative was useful? What if labeling someone crazy was the fastest way to ensure no one listened? Katt never attacked random individuals for attention. His target was always the same, the system itself, the machinery behind fame, the deals that never appear on paper, the conversations that happen behind velvet ropes. He didn't whisper. He declared, "I never had to do anything I didn't want to do to get paid." That sentence should have shaken the industry, because it implies something quietly terrifying, that others did. In an industry built on compromise, Katt's refusal made him dangerous. He was talented enough to be credible, popular enough to be heard, but independent enough to survive without total institutional approval. So the strategy wasn't to debate him. It was to discredit him. Crazy people don't need to be answered. They just need to be ignored. Or so they thought. When time starts telling the truth, then something unexpected happened. Time began backing Katt Williams up. In early 2024, when he appeared on Club Shay Shay, what once sounded like ranting years earlier suddenly aligned with real-world events. Names he had mentioned quietly became subjects of investigation. Stories long dismissed resurfaced with documentation. Patterns once called conspiracy began looking disturbingly consistent. And suddenly, the crazy man didn't sound so crazy anymore. The internet shifted. Clips resurfaced. Old interviews were reanalyzed. People asked a question they hadn't asked before. What if he was just early? History has a pattern of punishing those who speak before society is ready to listen. Truth-tellers are often mocked before they're validated. So how many warnings do we ignore simply because they disrupt comfort? The weapon called silence. One of Katt's most controversial claims centered on NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. He described them not as legal tools, but as muzzles. Contracts wrapped in opportunity. Fame packaged with permanent silence. You want the role? Sign here. You want the exposure? Agree not to discuss. You want the money? Understand the terms. Break the silence, and you lose everything. For decades, this system worked flawlessly. Fear kept victims quiet. Ambition kept them compliant. Money sealed the rest. Until the cost of silence became heavier than the fear of speaking. When individuals began coming forward in other sectors of entertainment, the dominoes fell quickly. Lawsuits multiplied. Investigations deepened. Public trust fractured. Suddenly, silence didn't look like professionalism. It looked like containment. Katt called this moment inevitable, the tipping point where pain outweighs fear. And when that happens, truth doesn't trickle out. It floods. So how many careers were built on silence? And how many were destroyed by breaking it? Tyler Perry and the power of the gate. Tyler Perry's rise is undeniable. From sleeping in his car to owning one of the largest studio lots in America, his story inspires millions. He created opportunities where none existed. He built wealth in an industry that historically denied it to people who looked like him. But power changes the conversation. At Tyler Perry Studios, creative control isn't distributed, it's centralized. Casting, scripts, production timelines, brand consistency, all flow through a tightly controlled ecosystem. For black actors especially, this doesn't feel like one option among many. It feels like the option. The place where careers can accelerate. Or stall. So what happens when someone inside that ecosystem refuses to comply? Refuses a role. Questions a script. Declines participation in something they feel compromises them? There are no public battles. No dramatic showdowns. Just quiet. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than outrage. As murmurs from former collaborators occasionally surfaced, the absence of aggressive rebuttal often replaced direct denial. Why escalate when time erases controversy on its own? So ask yourself, why defend loudly when silence keeps the system intact? Terrence Howard, The Cost of Refusal. Terrence Howard's career arc feels like a riddle. He reached heights most actors dream of. He commanded both indie respect and mainstream appeal. His presence carried gravity. Yet as years passed, something shifted. Howard began speaking more openly about his experiences. About feeling undervalued. About contracts that didn't honor promises. About creative decisions that left him uncomfortable. He didn't always frame it as accusation. He framed it as principle. And principle, in a transactional environment, can look like rebellion. Eventually, Howard announced his retirement from acting. Retirement. Not because audiences stopped caring. Not because talent faded. But because he said he was done playing a game he no longer respected. What does it say when a man at the peak of cultural relevance chooses to walk away? Was it exhaustion, disillusionment, or refusal? And how many others have faced that same crossroads, comply and continue, or resist and recede? The pattern beneath the personalities. It's easy to reduce these stories to individual conflicts. Katt is outspoken. Howard is eccentric. Perry is powerful. Case closed. But patterns don't disappear just because they're uncomfortable. Across decades of entertainment history, artists who challenge structural power often face similar outcomes: marginalization, character attacks, or career slowdowns. Sometimes it's subtle. A rumor here. A delayed project there. A reputation reframed just enough to make studios hesitant. Public perception becomes the lever. If audiences believe someone is unstable, difficult, or ungrateful, the industry doesn't need to say anything at all. It simply lets the narrative do the work. So ask yourself, how much of what we believe about celebrities comes from carefully curated storytelling? And who benefits from shaping that story? The audience's role. Here's the part no one likes to admit. The system doesn't operate without us. We buy tickets. We stream shows. We share clips. We laugh at the jokes. We validate what becomes profitable. If humiliation sells, humiliation continues. If dignity sells, dignity grows. But do we always recognize what we're endorsing? Entertainment feels harmless. It's just 2 hours after work. It's just a sketch online. It's just a sitcom. But culture shapes perception. Perception shapes policy. Policy shapes reality. When certain portrayals dominate for decades, they don't stay on screen. They seep. So the real question becomes, Are we passive consumers or participants? When refusal becomes power, there's something profoundly unsettling about a person who cannot be coerced. You can't threaten them with exclusion if they're willing to walk away. You can't shame them if they're comfortable standing alone. You can't bribe them if their dignity isn't for sale. Katt Williams built his career touring relentlessly, independent of Hollywood's approval. Terrence Howard, controversial and complex, chose to exit rather than compromise further. Refusal disrupts leverage. And leverage is everything in power structures. So what happens if more artists decide the cost isn't worth it? What happens if audiences demand narratives rooted in respect rather than ridicule? Systems don't collapse overnight. But they adjust when incentives shift. And incentives shift when attention does. The question that lingers. Maybe there's no secret room. No ceremonial initiation. No dramatic confrontation behind closed doors. Maybe it's subtler than that. Maybe it's just pressure. Expectations. Cultural inertia disguised as how things are done. But subtle systems can be just as powerful as explicit ones. Terrence Howard's silence feels louder now. Katt Williams' warnings feel less isolated. Tyler Perry's empire stands strong, but so does scrutiny. And Hollywood continues, as it always has, projecting dreams onto screens while guarding its inner workings carefully. So we're left with a question that refuses to fade. What if the most dangerous thing you can do in Hollywood is simply say no? Not to fame, not to money, but to humiliation, to silence, to becoming something you never intended to be. And if that's true, then the next question belongs to all of us. What are we willing to laugh at? And what are we finally ready to question? Terrence Howard didn't burn bridges publicly. He didn't wage war in the press. He simply refused. He walked away from projects most actors would kill for, including portrayals of cultural icons, because he believed the scripts didn't honor their legacy. When asked to portray black excellence through distortion, he said no. When pressured into scenes that violated his sense of identity, he said no. And when asked to surrender dignity in exchange for longevity, he said no again. That's when the label appeared. Difficult to work with. Hollywood's favorite execution sentence. Because once that phrase circulates, no explanation is required. The industry steps back. Agents hesitate. Opportunities evaporate. No blacklist is ever announced. It just happens. So here's the question every aspiring artist fears. What is your integrity worth when your livelihood is on the line? The illusion of choice. Hollywood presents submission as choice. You don't have to do it. You just won't work if you don't. Terrence Howard chose isolation over obedience. And while others traded compliance for awards and longevity, he accepted the margins. What he lost in visibility, he gained in something far rarer, autonomy. Hollywood may own the reels. But it doesn't own the soul of someone who refuses to kneel. Control disguised as opportunity. Why does humiliation matter so much to power brokers? Because it proves ownership. If you're willing to violate your own boundaries for money, you've already surrendered the most valuable thing you possess. From that point on, obedience becomes easy. This isn't comedy. It's filtration. The system doesn't want independent thinkers. It wants reliable performers. Terrence Howard became the cautionary tale, not because he failed, but because he refused. We picture him in a small dressing room one rainy night on a studio lot, the smell of cheap coffee and actor's sweat, a single fluorescent bulb buzzing above a mirror rimmed in bulbs. What went through his mind as he read those pages? Did he imagine the face of the person he would be asked to caricature? Did he think of family members whose names would be tarnished by a line tossed off for laughs? Actors are often accused of ego, but what if this was something else, a ledger of conscience? His agent sat across from him, polished shoes and pitch-perfect lines about career trajectory. It's a role that could change everything, the agent said. But change for whom? The room became a courtroom without a judge. Who decides what art should cost? He remembers walking home through a deserted backlit at dawn, the horizon an orange bruise. A security guard nodded. A camera operator carried a tripod like a relic. He had been to premieres and after-parties. He had been photographed laughing in rooms that smelled of champagne and plastered smiles. Yet in the quiet before the city woke, he weighed a different ledger, the calculus of honor. How do you measure dignity when the currency on offer is fame? Is legacy a thing that can be negotiated in a conference room, or does it live in the small stubborn acts of refusal? Friends called. Directors called. Offers arrived that glittered with award season promise. He declined. Not with a press release, not with a social media manifesto, but with the slow erosion of attention. What does erasure feel like from the inside? To be spoken about in whispers in an elevator? To watch an empty chair kept for you at a table that no longer remembers how to host you? And then there were the late nights alone rewriting scenes he would never get to film, imagining versions of stories that treated their subjects with care. Those drafts ended up in a drawer. If script pages could cry, what would they say about the cost of conformity? When the system starts eating itself. As legal challenges emerged and NDAs weakened, the silence lost its grip. The public began asking questions they'd ignored for decades. Why did so many people disappear quietly? Why were the warnings always mocked? Why were the messengers destroyed instead of debated? The pattern became impossible to ignore. Those who spoke early were ridiculed. Those who stayed silent were rewarded. Until the rewards ran out. Hollywood's culture of fear. This industry doesn't rely on police intervention, it relies on imbalance. Unknown artist versus corporate empire. Speak up, and you're branded radioactive before the investigation even begins. Most victims don't stay silent because they're weak. They stay silent because they're trapped. And when the public finally learns the truth, it's usually after the damage is irreversible. Warnings we ignored. Long before podcasts and lawsuits, culture warned us. The Boondocks satirized the system. Spike Lee openly condemned it. But warnings are easy to dismiss when the money keeps flowing. Now, viewed through hindsight, those criticisms don't sound bitter. They sound prophetic. The final question. So here we are. What kind of success demands the surrender of self? What kind of power fears refusal more than failure? And how many voices were silenced, simply because they wouldn't bow? Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do in Hollywood is keep your dignity intact. Maybe the question is not only about one actor. Maybe it's about everyone who ever swallowed a barbed line for a paycheck. What would the arts look like if the price of a role no longer included surrender? Who would return to the stage, and who would be gone for good? Will we choose dignity over applause?